Well, it's my pleasure again to welcome Simonetta up to the stage. And I realized I'm going to move your podium forward because that is still hitting me so that you don't get hit with it. Do you want me to move the mat forward?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So if you're all suffering from heat today, it's my fault. Because yesterday I complained that I was cold. Actually, I was really cold. I was so cold that when somebody asked me to sign their book, I couldn't sign it. My hand was frozen. It was amazing. So anyway, I asked them to move the podium, but apparently they put the air conditioning up too, so I hope you're not suffering. The thing is that I am right under the fan. Nobody else is, I think. Anyway, thank you for coming back. That's a good sign. And so today, you have some different mats. One is actually Monica, they got switched. And one is Sarah Miller. And so we'll be talking about Marcella, which is the one that you had the mat yesterday. And then Sarah. I say Marcella because I'm Italian. So that's how we say it, Marcella. I think in America they probably say Marcella. And I don't know, but in Latin, I grew up, I actually studied Latin in school because in Italy you had to study when I was young. And we studied the church Latin, that is with the pronunciation, the Italian pronunciation, because of course we Italians think that Latin was never changed. But I heard that now it's changed, like, scholars pronounce a C as a K. You heard about that? So that would be Marcella. I don't know. I didn't really go for that because Kikero doesn't sound that good. The worst one, if you listen to the scholars, the worst one is, when Caesar conquered Veni, Vidi, Vici. That sounds really good, right? Now, it would have been Witty, Witty, Wiki. I cannot think of, just bring Caesar down. Witty, Witty, Wiki. Well, anyway. So say whatever you want, Marcella, 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 I don't know. She was in Rome. So we went back in time again. She was also in the 4th century, just like Monica. And the reason I chose her is, so yesterday we did 2 challenges that were more family related. And then today, some different challenges that women faced. And one was education. So I think you probably know women in history had a hard time trying to get the same education as men in general, but also in theology. And so she was one of the first, and I think she's a good example of somebody that really tried to learn theology. So I think today in the church, from what I see or hear, there's still a little bit of tendency like that. Probably not with you ladies, because I heard you talking about books and you seem very updated with books and you love reading. But there are women, Christian women, who think theology is for men and we just talk about cooking or children, And so, yeah, that's a tendency, but I think theology is important. And I was telling Melissa, actually, that one time I was supposed to speak in a place, and they said they didn't want me to speak about theological matters or anything theological. And I said, well, anything is theological, because if theology is the study of God, anything, like, I mean, even cooking, you could say, could put in that category somehow. So there is still that impression. And I think it's good to just hear about women who spoke against that attitude and why they did that. So Marcella, I'll just keep using the Italian. So we don't know much about her, but she became a widow after only 7 months of marriage and decided not to remarry. So this was a tendency in the church in those days. When you study church history, you see things, some traditions, some attitudes would be different than ours. That's one thing I love actually about church history, because you see every age emphasizes something different. And so sometimes what they emphasize, we say, why did they do that? But if you understand why they did it, you can learn something even from that, and we complement each other. And it's the same with learning to know people from other countries, because we have people from Africa here and South America. And I think from what I've seen, there are different emphasis in different places, especially different continents. And, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe you see things that Americans do, and maybe for you, you say, well, that's not really a big deal. But then, we might have the opposite impression, and then we learn from each other. And I think it's the same in church history. You learn from the past. One good thing about learning from women in the past that I found is that you listen to them and you can't talk back. Like you go on Facebook or something like that, social media, somebody says something and you want to answer back. And you can't with them. And so you listen. So anyway, detour. But all that to say, at that time, there was a tendency not to marry. Like if you could avoid marriage, or you were a widow, then just don't remarry because you have more time with the Lord. That was the tendency then. Now it's pretty much the opposite. I don't know if it started in the 1800s, but it's like a very big push on marriage. We learn from each other. They had their own priorities and we have ours. But anyway, that was her decision not to remarry. And because she was trying to really give her life to the Lord and devote as much time as possible to the Lord, she decided to build a community of women. So it's a little bit like this, but on a more permanent scale. Some women actually lived with her, and some just went to see her and had Bible study, whatever. Today we would call it Bible studies. And what she realized is that she was like the head of the community, and people looked up to her, and she realized she didn't have enough theological training to help these women. So she was really trying to learn more. And we're talking about the 4th century. So a lot of church doctrines were still being shaped at that time. This was the time of the Cappadocians and the Trinity, and Augustine, helped a lot to shape our theology. And so it was still a time where many things were being discussed, and she needed to understand more clearly. And also the Bible, she spoke Latin, of course, but in those days, women, anybody who was like more higher status, I guess, they also spoke Greek. It was almost like maybe we can compare it to South America, where you speak Spanish, but also I assume many people speak English. Maybe, it's it could be something that English is the business language around the world. In Italy too, people speak Italian, but a lot of people speak English. So she spoke English. Yeah, I wish. We make it easier for me. She spoke Latin and Greek, but not Hebrew. So she could read the Bible in Greek, but not the Old Testament. And she had a ton of questions. And around that time, a young Christian priest named Jerome. Now, when I say priest, in those days, they said priest, but it's not, don't think Catholic Church. There was the church in those days. So Jerome, you heard about Jerome? Yes. See? Very, very smart crowd. So he was, in case you didn't, he was the one that translated the Bible into Latin. And he was young at the time, and he had a good reputation for knowing the Bible. And she asked him to help her to understand the Bible better. And initially he didn't know, he didn't really want to do it because he didn't want to go into this community of women by himself. And so not everyone was like that. There were people who didn't mind that, but he did. And she had to really beg him and say, please come and help us. And then eventually she actually studied Hebrew to learn so she could read on her own. But he helped her a lot. And actually from that time there are letters to Jerome, and you can see that he got lots of letters from women everywhere that wanted to know. And there's letters with a long list of questions. It's like questions women asked. I could put a long list. They all had questions. Today it's so much easier for us, but in those days there were very few people who were trustworthy, that you could say, yes, they really know what the Bible is teaching. There was a lot of confusion. So she learned Hebrew so much that she could actually sing the Psaltery in Hebrew. Yeah. So, and then, some people didn't think he should be relating to these women, but in the end, he really recognized that she had a true desire to learn the Bible, and to so much that in one letter he told her his Latin was not up to her standards. So she was really determined to learn. He had actually a difficult personality. That's, like I was saying yesterday, I liked reading church history because you find all this interesting things. And he would get upset very easily, and she was very good at calming him down. And so much that in one letter he said that, let me see if I find the quote actually. So he wrote a letter to her after he left, because he stayed in Rome for a while and then he left. And he said, I know that as you read these words, you will knit your brows and fear that my freedom of speech is sowing the seeds of fresh quarrels. And that if you could, you would gladly put your finger on my mouth to prevent me from even speaking of things which others do not blush to do. So, and I'm wondering, did she ever put her finger on his mouth, literally? I don't know. But it's just an example that she was able to calm him down. Seems like men were very fiery in those days. So Jerome remained in Rome for a while and then returned to the Middle East, traveling throughout the Holy Land and parts of Egypt. And by that time, she had acquired so much biblical knowledge that she was able to help her community, but also she was very respected in Rome. And people asked her advice, and she gave it freely, but she also made sure to give credit for the answers to Jerome. And partially it was probably to, to stay humble, but also maybe to avoid embarrassing the men. So she said, I learned from Jerome. So Jerome continued to encourage Marcella to join him. And so he was part of another tendency at that time to form monastic communities. That was a time when these were being formed. And she never wanted to do that. So her community was different. She had this community of women, but they were more like you, in the sense that they were just having Bible studies together. Some lived together, some didn't. But their goal was just to learn the Bible and pray together without going to the extreme. She did give up a lot of her riches, but just to help the poor, not just to try to be an ascetic. But then Jerome was very much into being an ascetic and living in the desert. So some of the women from her community actually joined Jerome, and they were trying to get Marcella to join, but she didn't want to. So also they were emphasizing at that time the importance of Jerusalem, the holy places, and she didn't share that view. She thought Christ is everywhere. So she continued until she was older, and then what happened is that she was attacked. Her home was attacked in Rome because there was the Goths came to Rome and they attacked her house and robbed her of everything she had, which was very little by the time. And then they also beat her up, and they mistreated one of her young disciples that was there, and Marcella defended her. And so at the end, she died. She died a few months later, probably because she was beat up. But she was very, very well known in Rome and very well respected, like I said. And she, one reason why she said she wanted to learn theology very well was because at that time there were a lot of heretics, and a lot of them would ask her for money, and she wanted to be discerning and know who to give money to. So those were all really good reasons, to help the other women in the community and to be discerning who to help and who not to help. So I thought she's a good example, and also she comes early in church history. After her, there have been many women who have spoken out about the importance of studying theology, and especially in starting from the 1800s, no, even 1700s, there were women who actually spoke about this subject and trying to say that women should study theology. One of them is actually in my book, and her name is Batsua Makin. I hope I pronounced it right. But so she also had 8 children. Who else? Somebody else here had 8 children. I had 8 children, but I know somebody else. Oh, you did, yeah. So she had 8 children too. And she was also the tutor for King Charles I of England. not for him, but for his daughter. And she tutored other noble women, and she promoted the education of women. And it's very interesting to read, and it's actually in this book. And you can find what this book has at the end. I have bibliography. I mean, each chapter has one, so you can go find it. It's very interesting to read what she wrote, because she was rebutting. Some men said, no, women should not learn theology at all. They should not learn because Eve sinned. Eve is the one that sinned, so it doesn't make sense. And she pointed out it doesn't make sense, because it says, if Eve is the one that sinned, shouldn't we try to get women to learn theology so they won't sin? It's like, or maybe they would say that women are too busy with other things, with the house and with the children. She was saying, well, men are busy too, with the business and the fields or wherever they're working. And she also brought up the examples of Timothy that was trained by his mother and grandmother, and then Proverbs 31, she said, to consider a field, the quantity or quality required knowledge in geometry. To plant a vineyard requires understanding in husbandry. She could not merchandise without knowledge in arithmetic, etc. So she pointed out the importance for women to just learn something, and she also said learning would be a hedge against heresies. Women ought to be learned so they may stop their ears against seducers. And she also said, I do not intend to hinder good housewifery, neither have I called any from their necessary labor to their book. She did not want women just to stop everything they're doing to read, but she just wanted to equip them to be able to serve the Lord. And then another one that came later was Hannah More, and I don't know if you have heard of her. You heard about it? Yeah, she spoke up a lot about the same subject, about learning, but especially in her time, she spoke about women who would spend all their time learning, embroidery or all these kind of things. And she said, yeah, these are nice things, but also you need to learn theology and just learn in general, because to learn theology, you have to learn to read, obviously. So just be educated. And she influenced very much Anne Judson. She wrote in her diary that she learned a lot from Hannah More to focus to whatever she's learning, to do it for a goal, not just to learn in general. And for her, learning embroidery, I don't know if it was so important, because her goal was to be a missionary. So she tried to learn the skills that would help her to be a good missionary, and theology was one of them. And this is what Anne wrote in reference to Moore's book. She said, as Providence has placed me in a situation in life where I have an opportunity of getting as good as an education as I desire, I feel it would be highly criminal in me not to improve it. I feel also that it would be equally criminal to desire to be well educated and accomplished from selfish motives, with a view merely to gratify my taste and relish for improvement, or my pride in being qualified to shine. So I thought that was very a good example of what Hannah More was teaching, and a lot of missionary women put into practice, to just learn to discern what to learn and then focus toward a goal that would glorify God. So that was the challenge of learning, and maybe you don't need it. It was hard for me when I chose the different subjects. I tried to have a variety. Maybe you didn't need to hear this because I think you're already on the right track, but I guess maybe it's a good reminder. So the second one that I have, Sarah Miller, is, now we're moving from way back. Again, we come into the 1800s. Well, actually, she died in 1801, so late 1700s. And we're moving to a more difficult challenge, which is depression. And I thought it would be good to bring it up. But these are subjects that we don't usually bring up in most meetings, but I was reading what they wrote in the bulletin about me, like ladies' fellowship encouragement. So, okay, I hope it's encouraging, but I think some things need to be brought up anyway. So Sarah Miller, she was the wife of Samuel Miller. Anybody heard of Samuel Miller? Yes. Yes, some people said yes. It's not very well known, but he was one of the first professors at Princeton Theological Seminary. Princeton Theological Seminary was like a bastion of truth in the late 1700s and early 1800s. It was a time when the Bible was being attacked more than ever before. And so you may not know him so much. Maybe you know B.B. Warfield. He's maybe more famous, yeah. So there were a group of people. B.B. Warfield came after, actually. Samuel Miller was one of the founders. But there was a group of people that stood up for correct theology at the time when it was attacked. But Sarah Miller, she didn't know anything about him before she married him. And so she grew up a Christian. And but then when she was like a young lady, she started to suffer from depression. She felt very, very depressed all the time. But her mother taught her not to talk about these things. Her mother said, never talk about doubts and never talk about depression or sad feelings or anything like that. Don't show it. So she said, I took her advice and began a violent struggle, which continued many years afterwards and so far succeeded as to enable me to put on the appearance of peace when all was panic within. I think this is very important to realize, because so many times we see people, they look fine, they look smiling and everything looks fine, and you don't know what's inside. I had a son with a mental illness, so I kind of understand this subject a lot. I wrote a book about it. But when I told my church that my son had this mental illness, so many people in my church told me, oh yes, my mother does and my cousin does. And I was thinking, where have you all been? I never heard anybody talk about it. So you never know. I realized that you never know the person sitting next to you in the pew. You don't know what's going inside the person. So I realized that when we talk to people, it's important in a church. I mean, not here, we meet once. But when you talk to people in your church, to go beyond, how you doing and how was your week? Big smile and that's it, But try to become friends and let people know you're there for them. So that was what I learned. But back to Sarah. So she actually wrote about all this in a confession that she wrote much later. And she said she was prone to melancholy, which is what they called it in those days. And to aggravate the situation, she also had some religious doubts. So all at the same time, and her mother said, don't talk to anybody about any of them. And she also had, when she was very young, she felt a bit indifferent about religion. She said the peculiar doctrines of the gospel as a system had never been presented to my mind and formed no part of the education which was given me. The Bible I read at school, as children generally do, and in the same unprofitable manner, without retaining in my mind or having my heart engaged in any truth contained in it. So she was reading the Bible without really paying attention. What made it worse, she had a friend that was reading theistic books, like books that talk about God as being distant and not caring about this, what people do. And her friend, that she only called M, she didn't name her by name, seemed to have become persuaded that the Bible was her worst enemy, and seized, this is Sarah's words, and seized with eagerness and read with avidity every plausible work which had a tendency to weaken or subvert its influence. So her friend was actually trying to read things that went against the Bible on purpose because she thought the Bible was her enemy. We find a lot of that today. There's a lot of people that have never read the Bible, but they think, oh yeah, all these bad things are happening because of Christians, because of the Bible, and so we have to be careful about that. But Sarah, being already weak in her thinking, she followed. She listened to this to this friend. And she said she did it more for neglect of thinking and the desire of being thought of having an independent spirit than from knowledge or inquiry. That's also very common, that people want to show they have an independent spirit, but they don't really read the Bible. So it's easy to say, oh, I have all the answers. So also she was more interested in having fun. She liked the theater and parties, and she loved fashionable clothes, and she became addicted to card playing. She didn't call it gambling because she was not really gambling money, but it was still addictive. She was playing all the time, and for a while, she thought it was like an innocent pastime, but then it became addictive. I mean, today we have addictions to social media, so or online games or whatever, and so we know that can happen. And so she said 3 out of 4 nights every week were employed at the fascinating table. And hour after hour passed away, each one finding us more unwilling to leave it. It was becoming quite indispensable to my comfort. Every evening, not thus employed, was vacant and tedious. And then finally she said, conscience imperiously said, this is a ruinous consumer of time. She finally understood, right? But she couldn't stop. It had become an addiction. So the fact that she had an addiction that she could not stop made her depression worse, because she found herself incapable of changing. And she said, I lost all dependence on my own resolutions since I had failed in my engagement to him. That was my only resource against myself. So all that became worse and worse. And then she actually ended up taking a medication that was popular at that time, laudanum, and it was a tincture of opium. that was popular. And if you read literature from that time, other people took it. I think Dante Rossetti is an artist. I think his wife died of an overdose of laudanum. So it was easy to get, I guess, and very, very dangerous. So that was definitely the lowest point in her life, right? So what happens many times, thankfully, in the lowest points in our lives, God comes through. And so first, a friend of her father was visiting her and was thinking of marrying, like, he didn't actually ask her, but he kept going to visit her. So that usually in those days, that's what he meant. But he was twice her age and he was very rich. So she kind of was thinking about it. She actually had no feelings for him, but she said, maybe if I'm married, I might feel better. And maybe I can devote my life to charity since he's rich, and that might make me feel better. So she was thinking, but before the man actually proposed, Samuel Miller came. And he actually proposed. And so Samuel Miller was, if you read about him, he was a very humble man. I have a blog online, so I actually wrote about him too. And the things he wrote were amazing. Like, he wrote about working with other people, and he said, I'm resolved never to get into an argument with them. I want to always listen to them, appreciate what they're saying. And everything he wrote, you could see, was really a very thoughtful man, very kind, and loved the Lord, obviously. But she didn't tell him about her feelings. She didn't tell her anything about herself, about what was going on for 6 years. She didn't say anything to him. And to me, it's like amazing. So how did she do that? And that's why I like to tell the stories as sad as it is, because it can happen. People can be that close to us, and we don't know what's going on. So, anyway, what he did, even if she didn't tell him, his influence on her was huge. And just the fact that he promoted the Bible, which she had always heard people putting down. He was so loving, he was so understanding. It started to help her. And so she said, instead of the riches of this world, the word of life was presented in every form that could heal a wounded spirit such as mine. So that didn't mean instant healing, because she was still experiencing feelings of despair 5 years after her wedding. In fact, she said they increased in bitterness, and she often went to bed praying that she might not get up again. Sometimes she envisioned herself performing some horrid act. And she said the bare idea almost drove me to desperation, and after rising a little above the suggestion, the thought of such a possession again reduced me to agony. So those things were still going on. But eventually the gospel worked in her heart. And at the end, she said that all her mental and emotional confusion was a preparation for the strong hope, which, notwithstanding all my sins and my infirmities, I now cherish. It took a long time, but it worked, yeah. So anyway, she decided to tell her husband after six years, and she knew he was going to be surprised because he had never said anything. But she explained why she didn't speak, besides the fact that her mother said, don't tell anybody. she was afraid. She said, I was afraid the result of my agitations would be insanity, and was sure if my state of mind were known, I would already be considered an insane woman and become a spectacle. So stigma, basically. Today we call it stigma. She was afraid of what people would think of her. Or maybe even to be put in an institution, which in those days were not pleasant. So anyway, she said that she learned to distinguish between a legal and childlike fear of God, and she came to a place where her confidence on Christ, she could put her confidence on Christ instead of human beings. She said, how to believe the gospel was the question. I have sometime of late been inclined to doubt my hope, because my exercises did not reach the popular standard, but I am directed to the fountain for relief and always find it there. And then her husband, he didn't know anything about this, right? But he knew her faith was struggling. He didn't know about her struggles at night and her tears in the bed, but he knew her faith was struggling, but he was confident. And one thing he wrote was, a variety of appearances still inspire me with hope that the time is not distant when she will be able to unite with her husband in the hopes and joys, as well as the duties connected with membership in the Redeemer's kingdom. Then 45 years later, the happy ending of the story, he wrote, she's better qualified than many ministers to instruct the inquiring, to answer the perplexed and anxious. Hundreds of times I profited by her remarks on my sermons and other public performances more than by the remarks of any other human being. So 45 years into their marriage, that was a long time. But it just shows how she had completely changed, so much as she could encourage her husband. So her faith had become that strong. So it's a good ending of the story. Not every story of depression ends well, but I think it's encouraging, and it's a good thing to keep in mind. She had 10 children, but one died in infancy. So basically, she raised 9 children. She kept busy with the charitable work that she always wanted to do. And then she also became very active in the field of education, because she was convinced that it was the gospel that spared her from a lot of pain. So she wanted to make sure that the other women could learn that. And she died in 1861, 11 years after her husband. And her story is all written for everyone to see, both in her own words and in her husband's words after he found out. So I'm ending this, hoping that it was encouraging, but it was a difficult subject to talk about at the end. But I found it very encouraging because has a good ending, but also how much love and the gospel and just being there for people can help people's lives. So, like I said, that one of my sons had a mental illness, and for me, it's very important. It's something when these things happen in your life, you kind of see things differently, and so it helped me to be more aware of other people. And when I talk to a person, not when I just meet a person like this, of course, but like in my church, trying to know people a little better and try to do what I can to help others. But it's good to be aware, just be aware in general. You don't want somebody to come 7 years later and tell you that they suffered for 7 years. So Okay, so that was it. If you have any questions, silence. I either scared you or bored you. Yeah.
What were the dates of Marcella's life?
Okay, it was in the 4th century, but she was born around 325, which is when the Council of Nicaea was gathered, and died in 410, which is when the Goths invaded Rome.
I have a comment. So I agree how important it is that we get some confidants, especially when many of the women here are either pastors' wives, missionaries themselves, and they're in foreign lands. And we do have the advantage of having a little bit better access to not a letter that's going to take months to get to somebody, but to be able to contact somebody if we're having feelings that are a little bit off. My mother had some mental illnesses, and in the 50s and the early 60s, they didn't talk about it, like you said, even back then.
Yeah.
It was always hush hush. And so we always knew something was wrong, but my mom always kept a good face up front. And she was a Christian, and she did trust the Lord. So we never knew exactly what was wrong with my mom. To this day, we don't know exactly what it was that my mom had issues for. But my vision was below hers, and I can remember her falling and kind of crying like a baby with my dad. And it's like, oh my goodness, Lord, help my mom. So I just want to encourage all of you to make sure that if you are having any issues, or if you see somebody in the church and you get to know some people, to do reach out to them. And because it's not easy on the mission field, it's not easy even in the church, and it's a lot of times we don't try to put up those good faces, but we really need somebody to talk with.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Any other question, or even about something else?
I have a question, this is kind of, and this is like, to go pretty deep, so maybe a more simple answer, but like, what's a brief theology around those with mental or intellectual disabilities? 'Cause I have a brother that has Down syndrome, and I do believe he's saved, which is beautiful, but you see people who are like, they understand so little of the world, so like, how could they even understand the gospel, which is what we need to be saved? So what would you say? But yeah, when you see people that are in those categories.
I actually had the same question when my son had mental illness, because there were times when I just didn't know what was going on. He had a very serious one, actually. And again, like you're saying, I didn't know how much he was actually understanding, even though he had said he was a Christian. There were times after that he seemed so confused. And then somebody helped me to understand. They were like, when you read the confessions, after the Reformation, all the Reformed confessions, they usually say things like, usually or normally, this is the norm. And, they always leave a little bit of a open... and so they leave space for exceptions. Like if you have dementia, you have some form where your mind doesn't work anymore. Well, the spirit is not going to be stopped by that. So the good thing about my son actually died. It's a sad story, but I have a book, I think it's still up there, that tells the whole story. But when he died, I was desperate, but also like the main thing for any Christian mother was to know that he was with the Lord. And like I said, he had always made a confession of faith, but it was like so many ups and downs. And my pastor at that time, his wife, told me once, the mothers are fruit inspectors. So we know it's all by grace, but through faith, our sons have confessed their faith, and then we receive some fruit that doesn't look really good, and it's like, let me see. And when we shouldn't do that, And so anyway, I still was doing it, even if I shouldn't have. I never went on his Facebook account, but after he died, I went there to see if anybody had written anything. And I found a poem that he had written maybe a week before he died. And it was such a poem of faith in God. So he had such a confusion, but when his mind was clear, he really did believe. And that gave me so much peace. And so I think it's important just to know the Spirit can work no matter what. It's not limited. And God allows these things for some reason, but he doesn't abandon anybody. So, your reform, perseverance of the saints doesn't depend on us, depends on God. So if somebody is not a Christian at all, then I don't have the answers. But if a person has professed faith, and even in the slightest, because one thing my pastor once said is like an apple tree, if it has one apple, like it says in the Bible, by their fruits you shall know them. Sometimes we think that means the more fruits, the better. No, but it could just mean you have one apple, you're an apple tree. And I never thought about it. And it was funny because I went home and actually we had an apple tree with one apple. So it was a very good image. But yeah, I think we just have to trust the Lord, and He's merciful and good. And that's something I can only give credit to the Lord, because after my son died, I absolutely don't know why I had more of an impression of God's goodness than ever before. I don't know why. It was just there. And I said, I'm not going to question it. I'm going to take it. And I'm really convinced that the Bible talks about God being good more than anything. So we need to remember that, I think. But we need to also be good to each other.
Thank you. I think these are good conversations. Don't let the lunch break spoil it. Like if you want to connect with someone and keep the conversation going, I think this is the time for that. And find those ladies of faith to get connected with that you can bind your heart together and be a pen pal to and communicate with over the next year would be very beneficial.